Taiwan, I'm Liao with a quick news update from here in Taiwan. Taiwan's President Lai has called on the public to pay more attention to legislative reforms. It follows the passing of controversial amendments to give the legislature more power to investigate government officials and private citizens. Rick Liao reports on how the changes have split Taiwan society.
Cheers of support and shouts of protests in Taiwan's legislature as it passes contentious reforms giving Parliament more power. Bills that have caused weeks of violence here in the legislature and mass protests on the streets of Taiwan.
We wanted to rebalance the powers of the executive and legislature, and so we can refine our democracy.
The reforms, once signed into law by the president, would give lawmakers the power to compel information from officials and citizens, criminalise contempt of parliament for officials, and require the president to report to the legislature and answer questions. Taiwan's ruling Democratic Progressive Party says it is an overreach of power. They accuse the opposition parties of not following due process in the parliament and say they are making Taiwan vulnerable to Chinese infiltration.
你们把国会没收了，把民主没收了，接下去当然是台湾香港化。
The DPP, which won the presidency in January elections but lost control of the legislature, has promised to reject the changes and take them to the Constitutional Court. The high political drama has split society, with tens of thousands taking to the streets around Parliament.
它并没有完全的实践民主价值。如果以后都可以用这样的方式来通过法案的话，我可能真的会对台湾的民主越来越没有信心。
Taiwan prides itself in its democracy and says these values are what makes the country different from autocratic China across the strait. These contested reforms have exacerbated deep schisms in the legislature and in public opinion. And for Taiwan's new president, Lai Ching-te, who's now just 10 days into the role, it's a bitter taste of the challenges to come in the next 4 years. Chris Ma and Rick Liao for TaiwanPlus.
To understand why the opposition parties proposed these reforms, Irene Lin spoke to Alexander Tan, professor of political science at the University of Canterbury in New Zealand.
Why are the opposition parties, the Kuomintang or KMT and Taiwan People's Party TPP, are rushing these reforms right now?
The only reason I can think of is the fact that they have the numbers. I guess with the election result from January, with the split executive branch, legislative branch, you kind of have an expectation that from a parliamentary strategy themselves, they would be pushing these type of things, at least the two of them, right? Because there's no assurance that the TPP and the KMT will always be together. So I guess for them, it seems like this is a project, so to speak, that is, I would say, a low-hanging fruit for them.
What does the opposition think the bills can bring to Taiwanese society?
What it is trying to bring, at least my understanding of it, is a little bit more balance in the executive-legislative relations, so to speak. As you know, Taiwan has a semi-presidential system wherein the executive branch definitely is stronger than the legislative branch. It's quite unlike the system of the United States presidential system, wherein you have a strong legislature as such, and the check and balance is much more evenly keeled. Semi-presidential systems tend to favor the executive branch more than the legislative branch. So one can say that this is an attempt, whether it's awkward, it's clunky, I don't know.
So the DPP and the anti-reform protesters are worried that the checks and balances that you mentioned would be disrupted now that the legislature may breach other branches' authorities. What's your take on that?
I'm not sure if it's necessarily overreach. Yes, we have that Taiwan has a five-power system, which is, in the scheme of global political system is quite unique, to be honest. But whether it encroaches on the control yuan's authority, I can't say. I think I will leave that for the Constitutional Court and the justices to interpret if the DPP or the government decides to bring this case over, right? Whether it's an overreach in the sense of the legislature. But if you look at it from a parliamentary perspective, then it's normal behavior by Parliament to be able to exert some control, or at least have some control of the executive.
That was Alexander Tan from the University of Canterbury in New Zealand speaking on Taiwan's recent legislative reforms. People living on Taiwan's rural east coast are concerned about plans to build major transport links to the region. They say unanswered questions about the economic and environmental impact mean the whole project needs a rethink. John Van Trieste has the story.
Residents of eastern Taiwan worried about their home's future. Lawmaker Fu Kun-chi wants to bring high-speed rail and 2 major highways to the area, making access much easier. But the plan to build it all in just a decade has sparked concerns there won't be time for a proper environmental impact assessment.
去被压缩到只剩10年的话，我们会觉得不管是环评这个程序、审查的程序、调查的程序，可能都会时间上被压缩掉。
And then there are worries about the project's possible economic impact.
甚至会不会开路其实是导致我们更多的人口外移，那更多的有钱人跟都市人来到我们这个地方自产，然后导致我们的物价上涨的一种恶性循环。
The region's large indigenous population is among the most concerned. One representative says it's not that indigenous people are totally against development, but they want to be informed about what's going to happen to their lands.
并且确实召开部落会议，向族人说明明确的规划具体的内容、期程跟影响，并且取得各部落的同意，再行立法。
Residents like these agree that if the transport projects really are to go ahead, there needs to be much more public discussion first. Eason Chen and John Van Trieste for TaiwanPlus.
With less than a week until the results of India's months-long election, our reporter Sally Ensign reports on the key issues at stake from Kolkata.
We're in Kolkata for the 7th and final stage of the world's biggest election. India's almost 1 billion eligible voters have been going to over 1 million polling stations across the country for the last month and a half. They're choosing hundreds of representatives for their lower house of parliament, or Lok Sabha. And next week, the winning party majority will form a government to lead the planet's most populous nation. Now, key issues at stake in this massive vote are high-tech powered economic growth, tackling corruption, inflation and unemployment, and social welfare policies, and bridging the deep divides between religious groups. Now, incumbent Prime Minister Narendra Modi and his Bharatiya Janata Party are set to win by a comfortable landslide because of his popularity among India's Hindu majority, who make up around 80% of the population. But among his main obstacles could be voter turnout. India has seen extreme heat over the last few weeks, with temperatures reaching almost 50 degrees Celsius. And opposition parties are trying to persuade voters that a 3rd consecutive term for the hardline Hindu nationalist BJP could be a danger for the country's Muslim minority. And they say it could represent a dark, more authoritarian outlook for the world's biggest democracy. John Su, Suvan Pal and Sally Ensign in Kolkata for TaiwanPlus.
Colombia's Congress has banned bullfighting. If approved by President Gustavo Petro, the ban will take effect in 2027. This comes after 7 years of campaigning by animal rights activists who condemn the sport as bloody and barbaric. Each year, some 250,000 bulls are killed in bullfights around the world, according to Humane Society International. Breeders and street vendors worry the ban will impact their livelihoods, and the new law would require the government to help affected people find new jobs. Once the ban is passed, only 7 countries in the world will still allow bullfighting. 6 people have been arrested in Hong Kong under a new national security law. They're accused of sedition after allegedly using social media to, quote, advocate hatred against the Chinese government. The new law went into effect in March, 4 years after Beijing imposed a similar bill to suppress political dissent. Treason and insurrection can now be punished with up to life behind bars. Hong Kong's government says the law is needed for stability, but civic groups say it's a further erosion of freedoms. Pro-democracy activist Chow Hang-tung is among the 6 arrested.
The government always criticizes us, the activists, the pro-democracy camp for destabilizing Hong Kong. I think it's the government, it's the national security law that's destabilizing Hong Kong. It's destroying the environment of stability, of security that people have been living in.
Amnesty International says last year saw the highest number of executions around the world since 2015. The human rights group recorded 1,153 people executed in 16 countries in 2023. It said there has been a sharp rise in the use of the death penalty in the Middle East, especially in Iran. Amnesty's numbers do not include thousands of executions it believes took place in China, as well as in Vietnam and North Korea. More than 50 countries around the world use the death penalty, including Taiwan. China's large military drills around Taiwan last week raised alarms both in the country and internationally. But as Chris Gorn reports, those living on Taiwan's Kinmen Islands near China may have slightly different concerns.
66-year-old Li Kai-chen is fighting to keep a tradition alive. He's an oyster farmer on Taiwan's outlying Kinmen Islands, which sit within eyesight of the Chinese city of Xiamen. He tends to oyster beds made of granite stones, brought to Kinmen from China more than 400 years ago. And right next to them, anti-landing spikes, installed to ward off a Chinese invasion, on the site of a long-ago battle in the Chinese Civil War.
在真正大家都为了一方面为了性命就是往外跑科田就是荒废一阵子，然后等战争过后，我们又回来，再重新再整理科田。
Then as now, these oyster farms are at the front lines of growing tensions between Taiwan and China, a fact they are constantly reminded of, whether by Chinese propaganda calling for unification or by Chinese military exercises around the island. Just last week, China launched a series of drills around Taiwan and its outlying islands, including Kinmen, encircling the islands with Coast Guard and Navy ships. But these oyster farmers are used to Chinese military activity and say they aren't worried about an invasion, but rather that their traditional oyster farming practices could die out.
船不会靠过来，因为有那个海巡队的在这边给他追，他不能靠近我们的岸线。
就是一些沿海的工商业发达开发过度就是把这个科田都就慢慢消失了。就是说，这个百年科田，它其实它不只代表的不是一个食物，它代表了一个文化，还有一个历史。
For the farmers, having good relations with China isn't just about politics. Chinese tourists have been a key source of the island's income, but they've been prevented by Beijing from visiting the island since 2019. In spite of all the cross-strait tensions, Li is hoping that will change.
希望能够陆客多一点进来，让我们的生意可以走，老百姓相对就有那个收入可以提那个。 生活就能够改善目前的生活。
With fewer people practicing traditional oyster farming and geopolitical tensions keeping tourists away, communities like Li's are faced with an existential dilemma and left hoping for a lifeline. Devin Tsai and Chris Gorin for TaiwanPlus.
We'd like to thank you for watching What's Up Taiwan. You can visit the TaiwanPlus website or follow our social media for more stories from Taiwan and around the world. Finally, take a look at the world's largest solar power light bulb display in Dubai. I'm Liao. Take care and see you next time.